The United States and Taiwan have always maintained a complicated relationship. Taiwan's official name is the Republic of China, or ROC. The government that was initially established all the way back in 1912 across mainland China following the collapse of the imperial Qing dynasty. The ROC was subsequently one of America's top allies during the Second World War, fighting against the Japanese in the Asia-Pacific theater. But following the conclusion of that war, the Chinese nationalist government of the ROC almost immediately resumed its long-standing civil war against the Chinese communists. By 1949, the communists had emerged victorious in the mainland of China and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. But the nationalist government of the ROC continued to survive and fled from the mainland to Taiwan, where they have remained at ever since. Both governments, the ROC and the PRC alike, never agreed on any kind of formal peace treaty and have remained officially at war with one another ever since, with both sides continuing to officially claim on paper to be the sole legal government of all of China ever since, meaning that the Chinese Civil War never really ended in any official capacity, and has remained frozen for the 74 years of history that have followed ever since 1949. The United States had been among the very first countries in the world to recognize the ROC government back when it was first established in mainland China in 1912. And after the retreat to Taiwan in 1949, the United States continued recognizing the ROC as the sole legitimate government of all of China for decades. And in order to deter the larger communist PRC on the mainland from ever launching an invasion of Taiwan to defeat the ROC once and for all, the US provided economic and military aid to the ROC government, and the ROC welcomed thousands of US troops to bases themselves on the island, which peaked in the year 1958 when nearly 20,000 US troops were stationed on the island. And it wasn't just American troops on Taiwan either. The US Air Force activated an entire air division that they headquartered in Taiwan, while the US even deployed some of their own nuclear weapons to the island as well. And in 1955, the US even signed a mutual defense pact with the ROC, promising to intervene militarily on their behalf if the PRC ever launched a cross-strait invasion, which all firmly deterred the PRC from ever considering such an invasion for decades. In fact, the ROC themselves in Taiwan, still determined to reclaim the Chinese mainland by force throughout the entire Cold War, offered the US to invade the Chinese mainland on multiple occasions throughout the 1950s and 60s. The closest it ever came was in the early 1960s, when, in the midst of the Great Chinese Famine that killed tens of millions in the mainland and the PRC's first nuclear weapons test in 1964, the nationalist ROC government believed there was enough instability within the mainland to launch a cross-strait invasion of their own, and hoped that millions of disillusioned Chinese mainlanders would end up taking their side. The ROC mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops for this operation, and requested direct US support for the invasion of the mainland on multiple occasions. But constant American refusals began forcing them to reconsider, and then in 1965, 3 ROC naval vessels were intercepted by the People's Liberation Army Navy and sunk by torpedoes, killing nearly 300 ROC naval personnel, which convinced the ROC military that they were not as prepared for a cross-strait invasion of the mainland as they had previously thought. All of the invasion plans were shelved. And then in the 1970s, the geopolitical situation for the ROC began to change dramatically. By this point, the PRC and the Soviet Union, the world's 2 largest communist states, were having a massive falling out. In 1969, the Chinese and the Soviets were literally on the brink of war over a series of border disputes and clashes in the Soviet Far East, in which hundreds of soldiers were killed and wounded, and the United States began sensing an opportunity. Washington strategically chose to begin switching its recognition of the nationalist ROC on Taiwan as the sole legitimate government of China to the communist PRC on the mainland, in order to gain the much larger PRC as a fellow ally opposed to the Soviet Union. And in order to do that, it became necessary for the United States to begin winding down its obvious military support for the ROC on Taiwan. By 1974, the US had removed all of their nuclear weapons from Taiwan, and by 1979, the US had removed all of their troops and equipment from the island as well. America's direct military presence on Taiwan was over, and then, for the first time ever in 1979, the US severed their official diplomatic recognition of the ROC as the government of China, and formally recognized the PRC as the government of China instead. This also meant that by 1980, the US had revoked its mutual defense treaty with the ROC as well, and Washington also stopped giving any economic and military aid to their government. But unofficial connections between the ROC and the US remained. Deprived of free military aid, the ROC switched to directly buying US weapons and arms instead, and the US government was more than happy to continue selling to them. From 1955 to 1980, the official US position on a PRC invasion of Taiwan was very clear. The US would intervene militarily to stop it. But after 1980, the official US position shifted to a policy of deliberate strategic ambiguity. The US would never publicly commit to defending Taiwan from an invasion, but would also never publicly commit to not defending Taiwan from an invasion either. There has never been another formal defense treaty between the ROC and the US ever since the revocation of the original one in 1980. And for decades throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, this American policy of strategic ambiguity was still enough to deter the PRC from ever considering launching an invasion, as the mere possibility of America's vastly superior military still intervening was enough to make the relatively weaker People's Liberation Army reconsider. Between 1995 and 1996, the PRC fired missiles into all of these zones to the north of Taiwan and carried out military exercises in all of these zones of the Taiwan Strait. And the US military responded by sending 2 separate aircraft carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Strait in a huge show of force to the PRC and a show of support to the ROC. And the PRC chose to back down. But as China's economy began dramatically expanding in scale since the 2000s, so too has China's military and long-dormant geopolitical ambitions. In 1996, during that so-called Third Taiwan Strait crisis, the PRC's annual military spending was only a paltry $14.3 billion, compared to the US military's annual budget of the time at around $288 billion, 20 times the size of the PRC's military budget at the time. But fast forward from then to now, only 27 years later, and the PRC's military budget has exploded by more than 20 times over to more than $293 billion per year now, which is currently equivalent to about a third of America's military spending, as opposed to only about a 20th back in 1996. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the final resolution of the Sino-Russian land border dispute by treaty in 2003, the PRC's entire northern flank became secure, and a period of relatively friendly relations with Russia has emerged ever since. That freed up the PRC to largely focus on its long-running unresolved maritime disputes with its neighbors instead. Their claims to the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands that are currently administered by Japan. Their unilateral claims to the entire South China Sea through their so-called Nine-Dash Line that directly clashes with the UN-recognized EEZs of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. And most pressingly of all, their decades-long demand for the ROC on Taiwan to finally surrender and submit to Beijing, finishing the Chinese Civil War once and for all. To better enforce these maritime claims, the PRC spent the later 2000s pouring its defense spending into rapidly building up its naval force, the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, into a world-class navy. By total number of surface ships, it has since evolved into the largest navy in the world, with a fleet of approximately 350 surface ships and submarines. The PLAN has designed and built 3 of their own modern aircraft carriers, dozens of conventional and nuclear-powered submarines, and constructed naval and airfields across the islands of the South China Sea, all while increasing their rhetoric that Taiwan must be reunified with the mainland again by any means necessary. And this is all why, ever since the 2010s, the United States has been following its pivot to Asia strategy, which has involved winding down its military engagements in the Middle East and Afghanistan to refocus nearly everything to East Asia instead, with the goal of deterring the PRC from ever launching this invasion of Taiwan that it appears to be preparing for. Even the long-running policy of American strategic ambiguity in regards to a PRC invasion of Taiwan appears to be waning, with Joe Biden, the current president of the United States, publicly stating at least 4 separate times now since he took office that the United States will directly intervene militarily should Beijing choose to invade. And to back up his words, just about every single thing that the US foreign policy establishment and military are doing right now, all around the world, is explicitly being done to counter what the PRC is doing to prepare for its invasion. And just about everything that the PRC is doing is likewise designed to counter everything that the United States is doing. The new Cold War is here, and both Beijing and Washington are preparing themselves to fight a cataclysmic war over the final fate of Taiwan and the future of China that could end up happening before the end of this decade. It is a war that neither Beijing nor Washington truly want, but it is a war that they are both preparing to fight nonetheless. And this is how they are both preparing to do so. For the US, the greatest difficulty of all in confronting China militarily over Taiwan will be overcoming the tyranny of distance. The distance from the US west coast to the Taiwan Strait is more than 6,000 miles across the vast and empty Pacific Ocean, while the Chinese mainland is fewer than 100 miles away from Taiwan. The PRC will thus be able to focus its entire military machine to the singular goal of taking Taiwan, with all of its bases and logistics operating within the same theater, whereas the US will simply not have this same geographic advantage. To compensate for that, the United States has long adopted a geographic strategy to confront the PRC known as the First and Second Island Chains. The first island chain, in theory, begins within South Korea. While not an island in a geographic sense, South Korea still effectively functions as an island anyway because of its completely locked down border to the north, with North Korea that nothing is ever allowed to travel across. The US has permanently maintained a very large troop presence in South Korea ever since the Cold War in order to deter the North Koreans from ever launching an invasion, and to also conveniently have troops nearby to China and Taiwan. Currently, the US military operates several bases across the country with about 22,000 total troops being present, including 2 US Air Force bases at Osan and Kunsan on the South Korean west coast on the Yellow Sea immediately opposite from China, both of which have dozens of F-16 fighters based at them that are easily within range of flashpoints in the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. Moreover, the South Korean government has recently made it clear that they will ask the US to bring back American nuclear weapons to the country as well, something the United States pulled out from South Korea back in 1991 at the end of the last Cold War, that are likely going to be returning again soon. Extending from South Korea, the next component of America's first island chain then runs through Japan, where the US has maintained a very significant military presence ever since the end of World War II. Today, in 2023, at any given time, there are around 50,000 US troops deployed to Japan across dozens of different bases all across the country, which now represents America's biggest overseas deployment of troops anywhere in the world. The single largest concentration of US forces in Japan today, however, is not anywhere within the Japanese main islands, but on the relatively small Japanese island of Okinawa, which is one of the most heavily militarized islands anywhere in the world. Following World War II, the US directly governed Okinawa and all the other small islands in the Ryukyu island chain until they were returned to Japan in 1972. And Okinawa in particular was built up as, essentially, a massive unsinkable American aircraft carrier in the Pacific fewer than 400 miles away to Taiwan. Still today, approximately 25% of all the land in Okinawa is covered by US military bases, and there's around 26,000 US troops who are deployed to the island, more than all of the US troops in South Korea, and a bit more than half of all the US troops deployed to Japan. Okinawa is also the site of the US Air Force's largest and most active base in all of East Asia, Kadena Air Base, which is also home to the US Air Force's 18th Wing, the largest active combat wing in the entire Air Force, home to bombers, helicopters, reconnaissance craft, and fighters, including brand new cutting-edge F-35s, that are steadily being moved into the base to replace the older F-15s. As Kadena is only about 500 miles away from the Taiwan Strait, the base's fighters and bombers are easily within range of launching sorties out to intercept advancing Chinese ships and planes during an invasion scenario. And together with the US Air Force's other bases in South Korea, they can easily cooperate together to battle for air superiority over the narrow Korea Strait and ideally block China's warships from being able to break out and expand the war into the Sea of Japan. Moreover, the US also maintains its only permanently forward-deployed carrier strike group homeported at Yokosuka, in Japan's Tokyo Bay, Carrier Strike Group 5, the flagship of which is the USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier that can carry 90 fixed-wing and helicopter aircraft. Accompanying the Ronald Reagan and Carrier Strike Group 5 in Yokosuka are an additional 3 Ticonderoga-class cruisers and 7 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, which make it the US Navy's largest carrier strike group currently in service and which is, naturally, very close to the Ryukyu island chain in Taiwan. Meanwhile, the first island chain continues southwestwards from Okinawa through the other small Japanese islands of Miyakojima, Tarama, Ishigaka, Takatomi, and Yonaguni, the latter of which is fewer than 70 miles away from Taiwan. All of these islands are tiny and remote from the rest of Japan, but they are becoming significantly more strategically valuable, as all eyes begin being focused on Taiwan, including Japan's. In 2022, amidst the Russian invasion of Ukraine and fearful of increasing Chinese and North Korean strategic moves in East Asia, the Japanese government announced an unprecedented plan to remilitarize and expand its defense spending to levels never before seen since the Second World War. The Japanese Defense Ministry has now requested a budget of nearly $53 billion for 2024, which will put the Japanese self-defense forces on about a par with the defense spending of France. In its 2022 National Security Strategy Report, Japan clearly identified China as its, quote, greatest strategic challenge. Consequently, Japan is investing its new upgraded defense spending into anti-ship and anti-air missiles radar systems, and newer, more advanced fighters and ships. And part of this remilitarization is being focused on building up the Japanese self-defense forces' presence on the southern Ryukyu Islands extending from Okinawa down to Yonaguni, transforming them into tiny Japanese fortresses. Japan first began militarizing these small islands back in 2016, when they constructed a small outpost on the island of Yonaguni with only 160 troops to conduct coastal surveillance. In 2019, the Japanese built 2 more bases, in Miyakojima and further north in Amami-Oshima, both of which were armed with surface-to-air and surface-to-ship missiles. And now in 2023, the Japanese are deploying 570 troops to Ishigaki, along with more surface-to-air and surface-to-ship missiles, with even further discussions on extending even more surface-to-air and surface-to-ship missiles and troops to Yonaguni as well. Unlike Joe Biden's repeatedly firm statements on American support for Taiwan sovereignty, no Japanese government officials have ever publicly stated that Tokyo would actually come to Taiwan's aid militarily as well. Nonetheless, if the Chinese invasion of Taiwan does take place and the US decides to intervene, it's easy to see how the Japanese could end up being dragged into it anyway, especially if Chinese attacks were to happen against US military targets in Okinawa on sovereign Japanese territory. If Tokyo and Washington cooperated together to stop China's invasion fleet then, their primary objective would be to lock down the Ryukyu island chain and deny the PLAN from being able to break through out of the East China Sea and flank Taiwan's critical east coast from the north. The east coast of Taiwan is of the utmost importance to the ROC and the Americans during this potential invasion scenario, because Taiwan is geographically divided into 2 separate halves by a massive chain of towering mountains that run through the island's interior. The western side of Taiwan is wider, flatter, and directly exposed across the Taiwan Strait to the Chinese mainland, making it the most obvious target for the bulk of the PRC's invasion fleet to target. The eastern side of Taiwan between the ocean and the mountains is far narrower, more surrounded by rough mountainous terrain, separating it from the west and opposite of the Chinese mainland, meaning that the east will serve as the ROC's primary rear base of operations during an invasion scenario, and it will be the final line of defense where Allied troops deciding to militarily intervene can land at to help turn the tide of battle, like the Americans and Japanese, denying the PRC any ability to flank Taiwan from the north or the south, and getting around to attacking this vital rear base in the east of Taiwan is thus of the utmost importance to American military planners. The northern component of the first island chain, consisting of all of America's military assets in South Korea, Japan, and Okinawa, along with Japan's military assets in the southern Ryukyu Islands, are thus designed as the northern pincer of Taiwan's outside defense. It restricts China's flexibility of movement during an invasion scenario from getting around to attack Taiwan's east coast from the north, and it limits them into attacking in a more predictable, straightforward frontal assault on Taiwan's more exposed west coast directly opposite of the Chinese mainland. But in theory, that still leaves the possibility of the PLAN moving to the south instead and flanking Taiwan's critical eastern shore anyway through the wider Baoshi Channel that separates Taiwan from the northern Philippine island of Luzon. But of course, the US is preparing extensively for this situation as well, with the next component of its first island chain strategy, the southern pincer coming up from the Philippines. The US and the Philippines, similarly to the US and Japan, have a long and complicated history. The US directly seized the Philippines from Spain back in 1898 and transformed them into a colony that lasted for decades until after the end of World War II in 1946. But even after the Philippines were given independence, the US continued maintaining a huge military presence across the country for decades afterward throughout the Cold War, just like they did in Japan and also in Taiwan itself for a while. America's most significant military bases in the country that remained were an Air Force base at Clark Air Base and a naval base at Subic Bay, which were literally the largest overseas US military facilities for a lot of the Cold War, owing to their strategic location nearby to both Vietnam and to the Taiwan Strait. Dozens of US ships and submarines were present in Subic Bay for decades, but then in 1991, two separate events happened. The Soviet Union began disintegrating, and with it, the Cold War was wrapping up, and in the same year, Mount Pinatubo, only 20 miles away from Subic Bay and only 9 miles away from Clark Air Base, exploded in the second largest volcanic eruption of the entire 20th century, with a force that was 8 times greater than the Mount St. Helens eruption. The eruption virtually destroyed Clark Air Base outright and buried Subic Bay beneath a foot of ash, which caused massively extensive damage. Before that eruption, the US was negotiating with the government of the Philippines on renewing their lease to both Clark and Subic Bay for $850 million a year. But after the eruption took out Clark and severely damaged Subic Bay, the US lowered the offer to only $250 million a year to renew the lease, which the Philippines refused. Clark was evacuated and returned to the Philippines in 1991, while Subic Bay was decommissioned and returned to the Philippines as well the following year in 1992. And with it, the US military presence in the Philippines was ended for the very first time in nearly a century, which further marked the first time since the 16th century that no foreign military forces were present in the Philippines at all. For the next couple of decades, there would continue to be no US military presence in the Philippines until geopolitical events in the 2010s ultimately ended up bringing them back again. In the early 2010s, China began enforcing its 9-dash line across the South China Sea much more aggressively. They began building military outposts on tiny islands within the exclusive economic zone claimed by the Philippines, and laid claims to all of the Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal that the Philippines also claim. Chinese warships began patrolling the area and sometimes firing water cannons at Philippine fishing vessels and ordering them to leave from the area. The result is that the Philippines began feeling threatened by China's maritime expansionism in the South China Sea right on their doorstep, and so they chose to begin upgrading their security relationship with the United States again. Thus, in 2014, the Obama administration and the Philippines signed a 10-year-long pact known as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which finally allowed the US to return a large-scale military presence to the Philippines once again. 5 Philippine military bases in the country were opened up to joint control with the US military, and American troops began being stationed at them in 2016. After 24 years of absence, US military bases were back in the Philippines again, and more would follow shortly. In 2023, the Philippines and the US announced the creation of 4 additional joint Philippine-US military bases in the country under the original terms of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which will bring the total number of American military bases in the Philippines to at least up to 9. I say at least because there are even further discussions happening right now between the Philippines and the US to reactivate the old Cold War-era US naval base at Subic Bay again. While not officially happening yet as of the production of this video, the Philippine Navy reoccupied a portion of the base near the end of 2022, while the remainder of the port was acquired by a US private equity firm. If the US Navy returns to Subic Bay again, it would function as an ideal deepwater harbor for some of America's advanced nuclear submarine fleet to station themselves at only a few hundred miles away from the Bashi Channel separating Taiwan from the northern Philippine island of Luzon. But even if the US Navy doesn't do that, just look at the map of the 9 joint US-Philippine military bases that have already been officially agreed upon just since 2014. 2 out of the 5 previously agreed upon bases from 2014 were on the northern island of Luzon, while 3 out of the 4 recently announced bases in 2023 are also concentrated on this same northern island. Regardless if US naval forces also return to Subic Bay or not, this will already place a very high concentration of American troops within Luzon, very close by to Taiwan's southern flank. In March of 2022, it was revealed that American F-22 fighter jets were being deployed to the Philippines for the first time. F-22s in any of these bases on Luzon will be capable of rapidly sortieing out during an invasion of Taiwan scenario to attack advancing Chinese warships and airplanes, while US-deployed HIMARS rocket artillery systems on the ground placed within the northern reaches of Luzon will have the range to strike everywhere within the Bashi Channel between Luzon and Taiwan, the goal of which will be to obviously block the advancing PLAN from being able to break through the Bashi Channel and flank Taiwan's vulnerable and critical eastern coast. Attacking through the Bashi Channel will be a primary war aim of Beijing's during the invasion, not only to flank Taiwan's east coast, but to also attempt a capture of the extremely important Taiwanese port city of Kaohsiung. Kaohsiung is Taiwan's largest port by far, that all on its own accounts for 62% of all the island's total cargo volume and the majority of its oil volume. Seizing Kaohsiung early on would deny the ROC defenders the ability to import large amounts of supplies, fuel, resources, and reinforcements, and it would enable the PLA to use it instead to keep funneling in more of their own troops, supplies, and fuel to the island instead. American HIMARS placed in the northern reaches of Luzon would be nearly within range of striking the area around Kaohsiung to attack approaching PLAN landing ships, or to deliberately destroy the port facilities themselves if they were to fall into the PLAN's hands. Taken all together, the US military strategy to defend Taiwan during an invasion scenario involves this northern pincer with their bases in South Korea, Japan, and Japan's Ryukyu island chain blocking any ability for the PLAN to advance from China's shores into either the Sea of Japan or out into the Philippine Sea, where they could be capable of flanking Taiwan's critical eastern shore from the northern direction. While the southern pincer with the US military bases in the Philippines is designed to simultaneously deny the PLAN any ability to advance through the Bashi Channel and flank Taiwan's eastern coast from the southern direction. The combined intent is to deny China the flexibility of movement during any invasion scenario, and to force them into only being able to choose a single option: a predictable, frontal amphibious assault on Taiwan's well-defended and prepared western beaches, while the east coast remains relatively stable and safe just long enough for outside help to be able to arrive and begin turning the tide. But America's first island chain strategy doesn't end in the Philippines. It continues even further down to another island, the smallest one in the entire strategy, but likely the most critical one of all: Singapore. The US has got a joint naval base down here as well that they share with the Singapore Navy, and which has the capability to accommodate an American aircraft carrier and its accompanying destroyers. During a wartime scenario with China, America's naval presence in Singapore grants it the ability to almost immediately take advantage of China's greatest Achilles heel: blockade the Strait of Malacca, a tiny 1.5-mile wide stretch of water through which a whopping 60% of all the oil China currently consumes passes through on its voyage from the oil-rich Persian Gulf. Halting any of these tankers from passing through the strait would immediately eliminate 60% of China's entire oil supply, which would immediately force Beijing into making difficult decisions once their stockpiles of oil start running out. Would they force rationing of oil on billions of Chinese citizens in order to commit more of their dramatically reduced supply to the invasion and war effort? Would their military machine eventually run out of oil and the invasion fail as a result? What would end up being the long-term impact to the Chinese economy with the immediate destruction of most of its oil supply? It's not a pleasant thought to think about in Beijing, and it's still not the end of America's island chain strategy either. Behind the first island chain is what American military planners like to refer to as the second island chain, which is mostly centered on small US territories of the Mariana Islands and especially Guam. Guam may be a tiny island. It's fewer than 30 miles long and only about 4 miles wide at its narrowest point, but it's very densely populated and home to nearly 170,000 people. It's also one of the most significant bases of the US military. Roughly 1/3 of all the island's land is owned directly by the US Department of Defense, with about 8,000 US troops stationed there with large numbers of fighters, bombers, missiles, and most crucially of all, 5 of America's most advanced nuclear-powered attack submarines. And unlike America's more forward operating bases in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Singapore, Guam is actually fully sovereign American territory and functions as the US military's largest and unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. It is also the US military's primary logistics hub for supporting all of the more forward operating US bases in the first island chain. But there's an even bigger rear base that the US military uses even further behind Guam, in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor is on the island of Oahu near Honolulu, and it is the headquarters of the US Pacific Fleet. Around 40,000 more US troops are stationed on the island, and crucially, 17 more of America's advanced nuclear-powered attack submarines are headquartered here as well, which is roughly 1/3 of all of America's nuclear attack submarines worldwide. Even further back on the US West Coast are the US naval bases at Kitsap, Washington, and San Diego, California, both of which are home to 1 and 4 more Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarriers, respectively. The base at Kitsap is arguably more important than the one in San Diego, though, because it's one of only 2 bases where the US stations its strategic ballistic missile submarines that are armed with nuclear weapons. 8 of these nuclear weapon-armed strategic submarines are based at Kitsap, along with 2 more nuclear-powered conventional conventional ballistic missile submarines, and 5 more nuclear-powered attack subs. And in addition to Guam, Pearl Harbor, Kitsap, and potentially Subic Bay in the Philippines again, the US is actively working to create yet another nuclear submarine base in the Pacific as well, in Australia. In 2021, the governments of Australia, the UK, and the US announced an unprecedented security pact between them that they called AUKUS, an anagram of Australia, the UK, and the US. Before this treaty, the United States had never before shared its top-secret nuclear submarine technology with another country besides for the UK back in 1958. For the first time ever since then, the AUKUS Pact will see the US and the UK sharing their top-secret nuclear submarine technology with the Australians to help them develop their own nuclear subs. As a part of the Pact's terms, the Western Australian city of Perth will become the host of the next major nuclear submarine base in the Indo-Pacific. American and British nuclear submarines will be stationed at Perth until Australia purchases a set of 5 modern nuclear submarines from the United States to station there themselves. And then, they'll eventually develop their own domestic nuclear submarine program by 2050. But the AUKUS Pact has been extremely controversial within domestic Australian politics. Australia agreeing to the deal necessarily meant that the Australian government also had to suddenly and without any notice cancel a prior nuclear submarine agreement that they had made with France that was valued at 56 billion euros, which resulted in an understandably outraged French government that recalled their ambassadors from both Australia and the United States over the incident. Moreover, the new AUKUS deal is currently estimated to cost the Australian government up to $368 billion over the next several years through to 2050. An extremely high amount of money that many Australians feel could be better spent on more domestic issues at home instead. But it's not just the new submarine base at Perth that the AUKUS Pact is creating. It's also creating a new major US Air Force base in the far north of Australia, Tyndall, where the United States will be allowed to park up to 6 of their strategic B-52 bombers at. These strategic bombers are capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and they have an operational range of 14,200 kilometers without needing to refuel, which places all of China's most heavily populated regions within their range from Tyndall. Together with the nuclear weapon-armed submarines at Kitsap in Washington and the potential return of American nuclear missiles to South Korea, this represents the full nuclear triad that the United States presents to China within the Indo-Pacific, with potentially soon-to-be land-based missiles in South Korea, sea-based missiles from the submarines out of Kitsap, and air-based bombs from out of Tyndall. One of America's greatest concerns about fighting a war with China over Taiwan will be China's increasingly advanced anti-access area denial, or A2D2 capabilities. China's DF-21A missile has a range of 1,770 kilometers, while their DF-26 missile has a range of 4,000 kilometers. These missiles have dramatically increased China's so-called area of engagement, the area where Chinese conventional missiles can reliably strike enemy targets. On the very first day of the war, the Hudson Institute calculated in 2022 that China could concentrate up to 11 kilotons of conventional explosive missiles into Taipei, the largest city on Taiwan. From there, with greater distance away from mainland China, China's conventional missile strike capacity diminishes but still remains relatively strong all throughout the first and second island chains, with a capability to even strike American targets as far away as Guam with about 2 kilotons of explosive power in a day. These capabilities make American surface ships, and especially aircraft carriers operating within China's area of engagement zone, highly vulnerable to attack and possible sinking all throughout the first and second island chains, which is why the US military's growing focus to counter China has been relying less on sinkable aircraft carriers and more on unsinkable nearby islands that they can park military assets on, like Okinawa, the southern Ryukyu Islands, Luzon in the Philippines, and also in Guam. In addition to underwater nuclear-powered submarines that can remain beneath the surface for years at a time and are invulnerable to China's A2D2 capabilities and missiles flying through the air. America's carriers and other surface ships would likely stay far away from Taiwan and far away from China's missiles, preferring to remain further behind within the second island chain, providing air cover for Guam, blockading Chinese maritime trade, and only briefly sailing in and out of China's area of engagement zone to attack Chinese ships and planes infrequently. If China decided to launch an invasion of Taiwan and the United States did decide to respond militarily, US Marines, armed with anti-ship and anti-air weapons, would likely quickly move to position themselves across all of Japan's southern Ryukyu Islands, and all of the Philippines' smaller northern islands within the Bashi Channel, extending all the way up to Little Yami Island, which is fewer than 90 miles away from Taiwan. Their objectives would be to hold their islands at all costs and destroy any Chinese warships and warplanes trying to pass through them to flank Taiwan in the east, buying the ROC defenders on the island enough time until US and probably Japanese reinforcements can arrive on Taiwan's eastern shore. US planes taking off from bases in South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines would immediately try and achieve air superiority all around Taiwan. America's naval assets in Singapore would likely move to sever China's critical oil import route, while America's many nuclear attack submarines in the area would stealthily depart from their bases in Kitsap, Hawaii, Guam, Perth, and potentially from Subic Bay to accomplish multiple objectives. They would seek to plug up all of the narrow maritime choke points found across the Indonesian archipelago, in order to deny China the ability to reroute any of their oil imports from Malacca, while more would patrol like sharks around the other maritime choke points around the Philippines and within the Bashi Channel between Luzon and Taiwan, and in between all of Japan's Ryukyu Islands and within the Korea Strait. All would be given kill orders to immediately attack and sink any PLAN warships trying to break into the Sea of Japan, the Philippine Sea, or anywhere into the wider Indo-Pacific, in order to contain the war to strictly being around China's own immediate shoreline. All of this while America's strategic nuclear triad in the Indo-Pacific theater with assets in Kitsap and Tyndall and probably soon to be South Korea all remain on standby for any potential escalation of the war from beyond Taiwan. Throughout the entire conflict, the specter of a nuclear war erupting between the United States and the PRC would permanently loom in the background. Never before in human history have two nuclear-armed military great powers ever gone to war against the other. The PRC wields an estimated nuclear arsenal of around 400 total warheads today in 2023. Including at least several dozen ICBMs, such as the DF-5B that can strike anywhere on the Earth outside of South America, including anywhere in the US mainland. By the end of the 2020s, the PRC's nuclear arsenal is expected to further increase, up to around 1,000 total warheads. Still much smaller than the American nuclear weapons arsenal, but also still the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, that will be plenty capable of annihilating the United States and ensuring mutually assured destruction between Beijing and Washington, should one ever be tempted to use them in the conflict. With both Beijing and Washington possessing such apocalyptic capability of annihilating the other with nukes, many theorists believe that neither the PRC nor the US would ever dare to strike each other's mainlands even with conventional weapons, which would imply that the war would be limited to strictly maritime, aerial, and amphibious assaults immediately around Taiwan and across the many seas and islands of the Indo-Pacific. The US argues that all of its extensive military preparations recently around China are designed to deter the PRC from ever attempting an armed invasion of Taiwan in the first place. But from Beijing's perspective, all of America's preparations certainly look extremely aggressive, and probably feel more like the United States is trying to contain them. I mean, just look at the map flipped around from their perspective. Their entire coastline is surrounded by US military bases now, which, during a war, will not only severely restrict their Navy's ability to sail out anywhere into the greater Pacific, but will also severely restrict their ability to import critical things they need from abroad, like oil, gas, microchips, and even food. China could be fairly easily placed under a total maritime blockade by all of the US and allied forces in the first and second island chains. And so there are some who fear that rather than deterring the PRC from launching an invasion of Taiwan, all of America's extensive military posturing in the area is encouraging the PRC to launch its invasion sooner rather than later instead. If you were in charge of China, wouldn't it make some sense if you were determined to take Taiwan no matter what, to at least consider launching your invasion of Taiwan before the United States and allied forces around you grow even stronger? Before the AUKUS Security Pact fully comes to fruition, with US nuclear submarines present in Perth, and US strategic bombers present in Tyndall. Before the newly announced US military bases in the Philippines are established, and before the US Navy can potentially return again to Subic Bay, before Japan can fully militarize its southern Ryukyu Islands, and before American nuclear weapons return to South Korea, and before Taiwan purchases more capable arms from the Americans. The more and more that the US prepares for this war with China that it is trying so desperately to avoid, the more it risks pushing China into deciding to launch the war for Taiwan in the first place before it becomes too late for them to do so. And China, of course, has their own ideas for how to push back against the United States and still manage to emerge victorious in Taiwan. Naturally, the PRC would obviously prefer to take control over Taiwan without having to fire a shot. And there are multiple steps that Beijing can take before a full-blown invasion comes. They can attempt to politically meddle in the island and hope for the return of the more pro-reunification Kuomintang party to power in the upcoming January 2024 presidential election. But the Kuomintang have been absent from power in the ROC ever since 2016, while the more pro-Taiwan Independence Democratic People's Party, or DPP, has been in power ever since then. If the DPP wins the election in January of 2024 again and it appears that political meddling within Taiwan isn't working as intended, then Beijing can take more limited, so-called gray zone actions to test the international community's resolve on Taiwan first, before committing to the full-scale invasion option. One of these options would be invading and seizing Kinmen first, a small group of islands home to 127,000 people that are governed as a county of the ROC that are 187 kilometers away from the ROC's main island of Taiwan, but merely 5 kilometers off of the coast of the PRC's mainland. Attacking and seizing Kinmen from the ROC could serve as the PRC's dress rehearsal for a later full-scale invasion of the ROC in Taiwan later. Would the United States, after all, really risk a cataclysmic war with China simply over little Kinmen? It would be very similar, in a way, to Russia's more limited invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, when they quickly seized control over Crimea and Sevastopol, which warranted very little Western intervention beyond a few limited economic sanctions, and which obviously precipitated Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 8 years later in 2022. China is currently watching very, very closely with how the West continues to react to the evolving Russian invasion of Ukraine. If the West's resolve eventually ever falters over Ukraine and they stop sending aid and then Ukraine subsequently collapses, it sends a clear message to Beijing on how long they might have to wait for the West to similarly capitulate over Taiwan. And thus, seizing Kinmen could serve as the PRC's version of Russia's early seizure of Crimea. And then, beyond that, there is the option to initiate a limited or a partial blockade of Taiwan. The PRC could declare either around Taiwan and aim it at the island's greatest Achilles heel, its critical overdependence on energy imports. You see, Taiwan imports the overwhelming majority of its energy resources from abroad, to the tune of 97% of the energy that they consume, including virtually all of their oil, liquefied natural gas or LNG, and coal. A lot of these imports come from other countries who are relatively friendly to the ROC, like Australia, who in 2021 provided 55% of Taiwan's coal imports and 32% of its LNG imports, along with the United States, who provided a further 9% of Taiwan's LNG imports and plans to expand those imports even further. But many more of Taiwan's foreign energy providers are not as solidly friendly and committed to Taiwan's sovereignty as Australia or the United States, and are substantially more vulnerable to coercion coming from Beijing. There is Russia, who in 2021 provided roughly 15% of Taiwan's coal imports and 10% of its LNG imports. Russia has previously shown a clear willingness to weaponize its energy resources against Europe during the war in Ukraine, while Russia is increasingly growing more and more dependent upon China at the same time. After the collapse of Russia's energy market in Europe, China has emerged as the largest new market for Russia to sell their vast energy resources to, and consequently, Russia sells vastly more energy resources to China than they do to Taiwan. If Beijing delivered Moscow an ultimatum in choosing between them, it is clear that the Russians would end up choosing China and halt their deliveries to Taiwan. And the Chinese might not stop there. Qatar provides about 25% of Taiwan's LNG imports, while Indonesia provides about 24% of Taiwan's coal imports, and a further 6% of its LNG imports. Qatar sells significantly more of its LNG to China than it does to Taiwan. Indonesia has received billions of dollars worth of investments through China's Belt and Road Initiative, and also sells significantly more raw materials to China than it does to Taiwan. And neither Qatar nor Indonesia have yet agreed to join in on any of the West's financial sanctions sanctions against Russia. China could thus, potentially, use a combination of carrots and sticks to convince all three of these countries to at least remain neutral or to even cooperate with a hypothetical Chinese blockade of Taiwan, which will induce significant pressures to Taiwan's energy security and ability to power itself, and further test the resolve of the United States without going full send to the invasion option. And then, of course, if all of these previous options fail to bring Taiwan beneath the PRC's control, there is the full-scale invasion option. The PRC is well aware that this option will be one of the most difficult military operations ever carried out in human history. It will involve the largest amphibious operation in history since the D-Day landings at Normandy during World War II, which will necessitate using thousands of ships, planes, and missiles to accomplish. It is estimated that China will need to commit somewhere between 300,000 to 1 million troops or even more to the invasion to have any hope of victory. And assembling such a massive invasion force with all of their accompanying transport ships and equipment on the western side of the Taiwan Strait will be impossible to hide from American spy satellites operating above, who will quickly begin sounding the alarm over the imminent invasion just as they began doing in the months leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The PRC's A2D2 missile capabilities on the mainland are designed to turn the skies dense with Chinese missiles that will keep the American Navy, Marines, and Air Force, along with all of their allies, far enough away from Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait to keep the invasion route open and secure for as long as possible. The PRC will need this because they need to win the invasion of Taiwan as swiftly as possible to have the best chance of success, ideally within days to weeks at a maximum. If they fail to quickly take the island and the war turns into a protracted conflict like Ukraine has morphed into, then the greater the odds will be that it will lose with a US intervention and potentially Japanese, Australian, and UK intervention as well. The longer China's maritime trade and imports of critical raw materials like oil and gas are blockaded, the greater the instability within China will become, to say nothing of the piling casualties and humiliation at not being able to take Taiwan swiftly. The PRC will desperately want to win as quickly as possible, and so, at the onset of choosing to launch the invasion, Beijing will likely have to take the most momentous decision that it will likely ever have to make in its entire history. Whether or not they will launch the invasion with or without a preemptive first strike on United States military assets in the Western Pacific. If they decide not to do that and launch their invasion without attacking the US first, it stands to reason that there might be a chance, no matter how small, that the US has been bluffing this whole time and won't actually respond militarily. And then, if the US does react militarily, China could attempt to claim that it was the US who fired first, during what they will inevitably be referring to as an internal Chinese matter where the PRC was simply trying to subdue a rogue province. But of course, not attacking the US military assets surrounding them first ensures that the US military will be at their full power and be most capable of restricting and defeating China's invasion force quickly. And thus, there is the significantly riskier second option. The 21st century Pearl Harbor. The PRC's conventional ballistic and cruise missiles easily have the range from the Chinese mainland to strike US military targets across South Korea, in Okinawa, across the Philippines, and even in Guam first. Before launching the invasion of Taiwan, the PRC could fire hundreds and hundreds of these missiles in a surprise attack across all of these nearby US military bases and facilities in an attempt to preemptively neutralize the US military's early ability to quickly respond to the invasion within the first and second island chains, which would then ideally enable the PRC to launch its cross-strait invasion of Taiwan rapidly and less opposed at first, enabling them to, hopefully from their perspective, seize control over the entire island quickly and then bunker down on it for the retaliatory attacks by the United States that would inevitably come next. This option is inherently the more risky out of the two, because, for one, it would all but guarantee a ferocious United States response to the scale of the war against Japan in the 1940s. It would also mean that China would be widely perceived as a massive warmonger on the global stage for clearly firing the first shots. China might also still struggle with taking Taiwan as quickly as they had hoped, leading to this eventual ferocious rival of the United States that would probably soundly defeat them anyway. Moreover, the PRC's military is still untested and lacks any real experience, as the last war the country fought in was their invasion of Vietnam back in 1979, which was nearly 4.5 decades ago now. The US military has very recent experience fighting actual combat in comparison, though of a kind that would be very different from the amphibious warfare that would be likely around Taiwan. And in addition to launching the main assault on Taiwan, there would also be a ferocious battle waged across the South China Sea, which the PRC largely claims in its entirety as Chinese territorial waters, backed up by China's claims to the tiny Spratly Islands and the many artificial islands they have constructed that are full of PRC military assets, including naval and air bases and radar stations. The PRC is so aggressive in their claims to the South China Sea and their construction of militarized islands within it because, during an invasion of Taiwan scenario, they want to be able to adequately project power down to Singapore and the US naval base at Changi there, so they can claw the Strait of Malacca open and keep their critical imports of oil and LNG from the Persian Gulf flowing through it, in order to keep their economy and war machine running. Nearly every single foreign policy decision and action that the PRC makes is all about overcoming this critical vulnerability that they know the US Navy will exploit during a war. It's partially why the PLA opened their first overseas military base in history in Djibouti, and why they're potentially seeking to acquire further bases in the future at Gawar in Pakistan, and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and in the Coco Islands of Myanmar, all of which, so far, has been unsubstantiated but could always happen in the future. China's relentless drive to pursue its Belt and Road Initiative is primarily focused on overcoming this over-reliance on their oil and gas imports coming through Malacca, and reducing the risk of a US naval blockade there and throughout Indonesia, crippling their energy imports coming from the Persian Gulf. China's support for Russia and the transformation of the Russian state into a sort of Chinese vassal state ever since the invasion of Ukraine has been designed to get Russian oil and gas to China through overland pipelines and the Northern Sea Route for LNG to reduce Beijing's dependence on Malacca. China has relentlessly pursued investments into other oil and gas-rich countries nearby like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan as well, in order to construct further overland pipelines bringing oil and gas into China in a safer and more reliable way that the US and allies can't as easily intercept as the maritime imports coming in through Malacca. And it's why China has also relentlessly pursued investments into and supported the regimes of strategically located countries around it that can transport Persian Gulf oil and gas into China before those imports ever even reach Malacca. Countries such as Pakistan, in which China has invested tens of billions of dollars to create the so-called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a vast network of highways and railroads being built to connect the Pakistani deepwater port of Gwadar with China's western Xinjiang province, through which the Chinese will eventually be able to import large amounts of oil through from the Persian Gulf, without having to rely on those imports going through the vulnerable Strait of Malacca. And even more crucially than Pakistan, there is also Myanmar, where between 2013 and 2017, China invested billions of dollars to construct the crucial Sino-Myanmar crude oil and gas pipelines, a pair of twin oil and gas pipelines that begin in Myanmar's deepwater port of Kyokpu in the Bay of Bengal and run for nearly 500 miles across the country to Kunming in China's Yunnan province. Since these are actual pipelines and not highways or railways like in Pakistan, the Sino-Myanmar pipeline enables China to import very large volumes of oil and gas directly from the Persian Gulf without those resources having to pass through the blockadable Strait of Malacca, making it a vital component of China's energy security and ability to confront the United States during a war over Taiwan. It is also why China so heavily supports the extremely authoritarian military regime in Myanmar, known as the Tatmadaw. In 2021, the Tatmadaw military in Myanmar launched an infamous coup d'etat that overthrew the civilian-elected government in the country, immortalized forever by this viral clip that you've probably seen of this woman dancing as the coup plotters behind her are busy actively overthrowing the government. In that coup's aftermath, Myanmar has descended into one of the most violent and devastating civil wars that the 21st century has ever seen, and become the only failed state in Southeast Asia. The whole country has ever since become more of a geographic expression than an actual united country, with a complicated patchwork mosaic of dozens of competing rebel factions all vying for control and influence against each other and against the increasingly repressive and authoritarian central government now ruled by the Tatmadaw military. The undemocratic military regime has also since become one of the most heavily sanctioned and isolated regimes in the world as well, which has pushed them ever closer into the orbit of countries like China and Russia. Without any countries in the Western world now willing to assist Myanmar's military regime, China now has extensive leverage in the country to expand their pipelines even further to continue reducing their oil and gas imports coming in through Malacca, and to potentially pressure them into allowing the PLA to finally establish an overseas military base on the Coco Islands as well nearby to Malacca on the strait's western side. As such, Chinese and Russian military vehicles and planes have been frequently spotted in the service of the Tatmadaw military in its complicated war against the many rebel factions now pushing back against it. And Beijing needs the Tatmadaw military to win the civil war in the country, because they need to continue maintaining their ability to keep importing oil and gas through the Sino-Myanmar pipelines in order to keep reducing their over-reliance on energy imports coming through the Malacca Strait, in order to be in a better position to eventually launch their invasion of Taiwan. If the Tatmadaw falls and a new regime unfriendly to Beijing emerges from the chaotic civil war in its place, they could choose to shut the Sino-Myanmar pipelines down when under pressure coming from the United States. And thus, the eventual outcome of the ongoing civil war in Myanmar has direct implications on China's ability to eventually seize Taiwan, and America's ability to counter that invasion. But of course, the Myanmar civil war itself is a very, very complicated and dark subject. It has resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the country only since it began in 2021, and has become one of the 21st century's bloodiest conflicts. But just before it began, between 2016 and 2019, the Tatmadaw military regime, who now mostly rules the country, even further perpetrated one of the 21st century's largest-scale genocides against the Rohingya people in Myanmar's western Rakhine state, which resulted in unbelievable levels of human suffering rarely seen since the 20th century, and the largest refugee crisis seen anywhere in Asia since the Vietnam War. The complicated and massive internal conflict still raging across Myanmar is thus one of the darkest chapters of all of 21st century history so far, and it is directly related to everything that you just listened to me talk about throughout this entire video. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and recent nature of discussing one of the biggest ongoing genocides and wars taking place anywhere in the world, if I made a video covering it all here on YouTube, it would almost certainly become demonetized and age-restricted, which would ultimately mean that YouTube's algorithm would never promote it to you, and you would probably never even see it. That's why instead of uploading it here to YouTube, I created yet another full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that's about the same length as this video you just watched, that covers the entire history, course, and explanation of the ongoing civil war in Myanmar and the associated genocide of the Rohingya people, and uploaded it directly to Nebula. And this is just one of more than 24 exclusive, full-length real-life-lore documentaries that you can only find on Nebula in my overall Modern Conflict series there. They can all only be found over there because of all of their darker, more controversial subject material. There are further episodes in Modern Conflict you can go and watch right now as well, covering China's own genocidal actions against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province, other recent major civil wars like the ones in Ethiopia, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, episodes covering how ISIS was able to rapidly rise to power in the Middle East and then was subsequently defeated, more episodes covering the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and dozens of others with brand new episodes releasing over there every single month that will help you keep up to date and informed with why major conflicts in our world are happening. And what's even more, signing up to Nebula will also get you access to all of the other amazing exclusive content from all of the other creators on the platform as well. Because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all of its creators, built by me and hundreds of other independent YouTubers and podcasters. Since Nebula is a subscription-based service without any ads and without any algorithm, we all get to work on way bigger, riskier, and higher budget productions over there than we could ever afford to do on YouTube. That's why there's tons of other exclusive content you'll find equally fascinating from channels that are very similar to my own, like Wendover Productions' The Logistics of X series, exploring the complex variables that influence how our society functions, Real-Time History's Red Atom series covering the entire history of the Soviet nuclear program, Real Engineering's Battle of Britain series covering how the Royal Air Force was able to defeat the German Luftwaffe during World War II, Neo's Underexposure series covering topics like the Tenerife disaster, the Osama bin Laden raid, and the MH17 disaster over Ukraine, and many, many more, with new content coming out every single month. And if you sign up for Nebula using my link, you'll also get access to all of Nebula classes, where our creators host classes on how to be, well, a creator. There's classes by Sam from Wendover Productions on persuasive communication, or by Devin from Legal Eagle on copyright laws, or by Patrick Willems on how to make a movie, and dozens of others, all of which are great for aspiring future creators or anyone who just wants a peek behind the curtain. And best of all, if you sign up by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link that's down below in the description, you'll receive an insane 40% discount for an annual subscription, which means it'll only cost you $2.50 a month for all of this awesome exclusive content from myself and hundreds of other independent creators, with more being added all the time. It's the absolute best way to help support what I'm doing here on RealLifeLore, and as always, thank you so much for watching.